Let's pick up the conversation on State of Play with Steve Tanzer from DelawareLiberal.net. Steve, good to see you again.
It's good to see you as well.
Democrats retain control of the Delaware State Senate. How are we supposed to view the results of Saturday's special election? You know, was this just a huge vote against President Trump, or was this just what big money can do for a Democratic candidate, or was it the beginning of a movement to galvanize the Democratic Party nationally?
I think there's some of all three in there. However, what you really want to look at, and I think this is the message, was this was a special election. Usually it's all you can do to get maybe 10% of the voters in a given district out for a special election. Over 35,000 voters came out for this. I'm sorry. Can we
Yeah, we can start over.
Okay. Da, 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 da. I had it all memorized.
Don't worry about it.
Okay.
Beauty of tape.
You're still wrong.
Okay. State of Play. Don't beat yourself up. State of Play, take two. Let's pick up the conversation on State of Play with Steve Tanzer from DelawareLiberal.net. Steve, thanks for being here.
My pleasure.
You know, Democrats retain control of the Delaware Senate, so how do we look at the results from Saturday's special election? Was this a huge vote against President Trump? Was this a showing of what big money can do for a Democratic candidate? Or was this beginning of a movement to galvanize the Democratic Party nationally?
I think it definitely was a vote against Trump, and definitely a message that perhaps the Democrats are beginning to galvanize nationally. There are 35,000 registered voters in the senatorial district. Usually it's all you can do to maybe get 10, 12% at most out for a special election. Yet in this election, we had well over 12,000 voters. 35% plus of the electorate came out to vote. That is an incredible amount of voters. So clearly, in an election where there is a Democratic edge in terms of registration, if you have something approximating a general election turnout, the Democrats are likely to win unless the Republican candidate is all that. And Marino did not turn out to be all that.
$1 million, though, was put into Stephanie Hanson's campaign. I mean, this is for the District of Middletown, right? The 10th Senatorial District. Did the Election Commission make the right call to allow that sort of PAC money to come in? Because, you know, the GOP had said that they felt the PAC money had tipped the scales in the Democrats' favor.
Well, keep in mind now, I mean, everything was legal, I think, in terms of the PAC money. A lot of that money was really grassroots money, which was funneled through some newly created PACs designed, in fact, to maximize the effectiveness of the grassroots. I find it ironic, having worked in the legislature for as long as I did, knowing full well that we would always be outspent by Republicans because there were always 50 people out in Greenville who would write $600 checks for any candidate who came along, which was $30,000 just like that. In fact, I think a lot of that money had no impact. In fact, Richard Pryor once said the cocaine is God's way of telling you you're making too much money. Doing television commercials that only 2 or 3%, perhaps, of prospective voters in the district are viewing is sort of the equivalent of the Pryor theorem there. So you can say, they can make that argument. I think, however, the results were so non-competitive. A 2,200 vote margin, a campaign, the Marino campaign, which imploded 2 weeks before the election. You have the campaign manager and volunteer coordinator leaving the campaign. I mean, that's unheard of.
So they saw the writing on the wall, you think, or? I
mean, we have Republican sources as well as Democratic sources at Delaware Liberal. No, they just got fed up with Marino, the person, and the candidate.
What about? Can you say?
I mean, that's all I was told.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, Marino was not necessarily well liked even by the people who were working on his behalf.
Okay, well, speaking of John Marino, you know, he told us that, or he had tried to run for the same seat, lost in 2010, did it again in 2014, ran in this special election. Is he just done in Delaware politics?
Well, it wasn't the same seat. He ran for a representative seat back in 2010, and lost a close election to Rebecca Walker. And then he did move. And so it is correct that he ran against Bethany Hall Long in 2014. That race was close, but there was the extenuating circumstance of 2 weeks before the election, her husband getting caught stealing Republican signs.
Right.
I mean, you never say never, but yes, I think so, and I certainly think that Republicans in particular will be looking for alternatives when positions open up in that general area.
Okay, Stephanie Hansen's getting sworn in on March 14th. What do you think the first order of business is?
I think the first order of business after the swearing in will be voting Sean Garvin's nomination to be DENREC secretary through. I think Republicans made a big mistake there. I don't know if it really impacted the election, but coming from Republicans like Greg Lavelle, who represents a district with a lot of environmentalists in it, saying he represents the worst of the Obama environmental regimen, probably wasn't the smartest thing to do. So yes, he will be voted in. I think several Republicans will actually vote for him.
We're going to get to the legislative agenda in a minute, but want to talk about Carney doing his, budget reset roadshow, that sort of listening tour. He's going to present a budget in a few weeks. How do you think all of that is going to shake out?
Oh, the real question with Carney is he going to consider only budget cuts, or is he going to also consider revenue enhancers? He's given off signals that he's not really interested in revenue enhancement, especially when it comes to a couple of tax breaks to tax Delaware's wealthiest, or those making the most money in Delaware. We have a flat tax in Delaware now for those making over $60,000 a year. Didn't always used to be the case. We had actually a very progressive tiered system, but over the years that became very much closed, so that now if you earn $60,000 a year, you pay the same percentage of tax as those earning over like $3 million a year.
Wow.
One possibility, which I hope he will do, and which his Secretary of State, Jeff Bullock, has said would be perfectly fine, is an increase in the corporate franchise tax. It's not going to drive businesses out of the state, according to the Secretary of State. It'll raise just about a third of what is needed to close the prospective gap that Carney is facing.
And there's still the question about what's going to happen with the correctional officers following the whole Vaughn situation.
There are areas where you're going to have to spend more money. I mean, this is a can that's been kicked down the road since the beginning of Ruth Ann Minter's second term. And it just can't be kicked down the road anymore. I mean, what are they going to do? I don't know, but clearly more funding is going to have to be, located to fund those things. They're going to be in courts again. I can guarantee you that it's kind of under a virtual lockdown in terms of information coming out of those courts now, out of those prisons now. I mean, something is going to have to be done, and they're going to have to find some revenue somewhere.
Okay, Steve Tanzer of DelawareLiberal.net, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for being a part of State of Play.
My pleasure.